So it's Bible history, and we're picking up, let's see, the first period is beginnings, and the second period is the patriarchal, the rest of the book of Genesis, and then the third period is Exodus, and then, of course, after wandering around for 40 years, they're back to the land of Canaan, and the fourth period is the conquest of the fifth period we were on last time around, and that was Judges. Now, I have my Bible open, and if you'll open with me to 1 Samuel, and we're looking at the 7th chapter, 1 Samuel, chapter 7. And I'm down to verse 15, and you should have underlined last time, where it says, Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. Samuel is the last of the judges. And so out in the margin is number 16. And then you have all the judges wrapped up and cared for. But Samuel is not only the last of the judges. He is a transition person, as you'll see. For the nation now is shifting, it's moving. That turbulent, somewhat tragic time of the judges where they were up and down, worshiping evil gods, false gods, and then being punished by the Lord by his allowing pagan nations to run them ragged. And then the judge is raised up to deliver them, and then they go through the whole thing again after the judge dies. So the Judges is a good time to get away from. And the last verse of the book of Judges, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Chaos, moral turbulence, disarray. But now Samuel becomes the transition person. Last of the judges, transitioning into the time of the kingdom, the United Kingdom. So you have that marked. We're in chapter 8, and it says Samuel became old. Happens to all of us, slowly, but definitely. He made his sons judges, but they were a bad lot. It sounds like they were predating the Chicago politicians here. It says, verse 3 of chapter 8, well, they didn't walk in the ways of their father. They went after gain. They were money lovers. They took bribes. They perverted justice. In other words, they weren't serving the Lord, and they surely weren't serving the people. They were serving themselves, looking out for themselves. And so at the end of verse 5 here of 1 Samuel 8, the people are on to Samuel. We want a king like all the nations around us. Oh, we want to be like everybody else, always, not necessarily what the Lord wants. But Samuel warns them. He says, verse 11, there'll be the ways of the king, and you'll have troubles. He'll make war and conscript your kids. He'll take verse 15. He'll tax the socks off your feet, and there'll be trouble. But verse 19, they're adamant. There shall be a king over us. So we're like, verse 20, all the other nations. So we're down to chapter 9, and we're about 1050 BC at this point, the time of the judges. took about 400 years. And so we're moving toward the 1000 BC mark. And in the tribe of Benjamin, which was a 2-bit tribe, very, very small, and right next to Judah, there was a man there by the name, it says, of Kish. And he had a son, verse 2, and you're underlining Saul, because Saul is going to become the first king. Well, he was a Hollywood type. Verse 2, it says he was a handsome young man, a looker. And there was not a man, it says, among the people of Israel more handsome than he. And he was tall, so it all looked good. But Saul was mostly good on the outside and not so good on the inside. His father had some donkeys, and they had wandered off. We're down in verse 3 and 4 of chapter 9. And he sent his son Saul to find them. No. He could not find them, it says at the end of verse 4. And he's ready to go back. Verse 5 to his father, a failure, come back, no donkeys. But his servant who was with him said, there's a man of God. Oh, there's always good for a man of God to be around, not just a good looker, not a self-promoter, not someone who's interested only in himself, but a man of God. Let's go find him. Verse 9, they go, it says, to the seer. So you take the verb see and turn it into a noun, and the seer, another word for a prophet, someone who has some spiritual insight. And so verse 11, they're looking for him. And verse 14, they come upon Samuel. And 15, before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, tomorrow from the land of Benjamin, someone is going to wander into your place. And this is important. And he's looking for donkeys, and they're found, of course. Verse 20, the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, this is where you'll find them. And it says down at the end of 24 that Saul ate with Samuel. In those days, there were no, McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger Kings around. If you showed up at someone's house, it was assumed you were hungry, and there was always something to eat. And then we are now to chapter 10 in 1 Samuel, and you have your pen, your pencil, and you're underlining verse 1. Samuel, a prophet, Samuel, the last judge, took a flask of oil. By the way, when it says oil in the Bible, it doesn't mean petroleum like you pour into your car. This is always olive oil. Whenever it says oil, it's olive oil. And he poured it on his head. And at the end of verse 1, it says, this shall be a sign. The Lord has anointed you to be a prince over his heritage. And so now, from this point on, Saul is the king, and he's going to be king for about 40 years. And it says this perplexes some people. Was Saul a believer or not? Was he a saved man or a lost man? And it's verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you, and you'll be turned into another man. So some debate that. Did he become a believer? Well, perhaps not. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him to enable him to serve as a king. But he's not much of a believer, for sure, as the record goes on. And in verse 9, when he left Samuel, it says, God gave him another heart. Was he born again? No. The people have proclaimed they wanted a king. Now they've got one. And so he had, end of verse 22, he was reticent, hiding himself. But at the end of 24, verse 24 of chapter 10, long live the king. The people finally have what they want, a king, and they're happy, and they have Saul. He's a young fellow, he's good looking, he's tall, and they're all happy people. And of course, what's a king good for? Well, a king is good for leading the troops into battle and taking care of your enemies. What good is a king if he doesn't bring peace to the land? And so in chapter 11, he's out against the Ammonites, the people who dwelt somewhat to the southwest, to the southeast, I should have said, the southeast side, on the other side of the Dead Sea. And he went after them, and they're scared to death. They say, make a treaty with us, but on this condition, he says, verse 2, I'll make a treaty that I gouge out your right eyes. Those were brutal days, of course. And so it goes on, he is the king, the kingdom's renewed. Chapter 12, you have Samuel, last judge, a prophet, Samuel's farewell address to the people. And if you haven't read that, don't miss it. Now we're over to chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, and Saul lived for 1 year and then became king, and takes care of the lapse in there. And then he has 3,000 men of Israel. And verse 4, he's going after the Philistines. The Philistines were always a pain to the people of God. They lived down in what today we call the Gaza Strip, where the cities of Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and so on are. And the Philistines, this is you get from this the Palestine, that the land was called. But they were a fierce and a warlike people. And so there's trouble with them. Then Saul makes a sacrifice. He offers, verse 9, a burnt offering. That was for the priest to do, not for the king. Samuel says to him, verse 13, you have done foolishly. Know what your role is. Fulfill it. Don't get out of it. Now, the word from Samuel in verse 14 is, your kingdom will not continue. In other words, you've done yourself in and you'll pay for this. Something else interesting in chapter 10. Look at verse 19. There was no blacksmith. My paternal grandfather, who I never met because he died long before I was born, got the flu, pneumonia, he was gone. But he was a blacksmith. And now it says, verse 19, there was no blacksmith to be found in the land of Israel. The Philistines had taken care of that. So every time that some Jew wanted his plowshare sharpened or his spear sharpened, he had to go down to the Philistines. So what do you have in verse 19? The Jews have been disarmed. Oh my. We've seen it in somewhat modern times. The nations around Germany, when Hitler came into power, were disarmed, so they were helpless. It is dangerous for a people to be disarmed. They're easily trodden underfoot, taken over, and made captives and slaves. So verse 22, it says, so if they brought a sword down to the Philistines to be sharpened, the blacksmith of the Philistines would say, well, I'll have it for you. You come back and get it. But it was never available. It was just confiscated, that's all. Verse 22, there was neither sword nor spear found of any of the people of Saul. They were disarmed and at the mercy of the Philistines. We come to chapter 14, verse 1. Jonathan, Saul's son. Underline Jonathan because he's a key figure and he's going to be actually a friend of David who's going to come on the scene. So Jonathan is a good fellow. Then Saul keeps on. Saul just is not a good king. He does not do too well. And you find this especially in chapter 15, where he goes out to fight the Amalekites. And this does not turn out well. He's supposed to wipe them out, but he saves some of the best of the cattle, a little greedy, and he saves the king, verse 8, Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And so when he comes back from war, Samuel says, did you do what God says? Oh, yes, everything's done. You know, I took it. Samuel says, what means the bleating of the sheep in my ear? Oh, he said, well, I saved them to sacrifice. Ah, what a liar he was. Verse 22 of 1 Samuel 15, has the Lord a greater delight in burnt offering and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? No. So God is through with Saul. He didn't obey. You got to keep on good terms with God. It helps to do what he says, that's all. End of verse 26, chapter 15, verse 26. The Lord has rejected you from being king. And when the Lord is through with you, that's the end. That's the finish of it. And so we come down to really the end of Saul being king. The Lord withdraws his presence from him, and there's someone else who's going to come on the scene and be the second king. And I hope you start reading 1 Samuel, starting with verse 16, and go right to the end of this book, because next time we're going to be on the next king, the successor of Saul. And now we're going to get us a real king.